She was born into one of the great shipping fortunes of the 20th century. She married the two richest Greek men alive. Beautiful, envied, photographed in every harbor that mattered. And in October of 1974, in a quiet Paris mansion, she died the same way her sister had 4 years before. Before we go further, this is Darkest Gates. If you find these stories worth your time, subscribe so the next one finds you, and tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from. We always like to know who is sitting with these stories alongside us. To understand how a woman ends up dying alone in a Paris mansion at 45, you have to go back to the beginning, to the world she was born into, because that world explains almost everything that came after. Athina Mary Livanos was born on the 19th of March, 1929, in Kensington, London. Everyone called her Tina. She was the second of 3 children, born into a family that did not measure its wealth the way ordinary people measure wealth. The Livanos family measured it in ships. Her father was Stavros Livanos, and to understand Tina, you first have to understand him. He came from the island of Chios, a small rocky place in the Aegean Sea that had produced Greek shipping families for generations. The Livanos name went back centuries in that trade. But Stavros did not inherit an empire. He built one. He started with a handful of vessels and an instinct for the sea and for money that bordered on the uncanny, and by the time Tina was a girl, he controlled one of the largest privately held fleets in the world. He was not flashy about it. He was the kind of man who wore the same overcoat for years and counted every drachma, even as he became one of the richest men in Europe. That combination, enormous wealth and almost severe restraint, was the air Tina breathed as a child. Her mother was Arietta Zafirakis, considerably younger than Stavros, beautiful and elegant in the way that the wives of shipping magnates were expected to be. There were 3 children in all. Eugenia came first in 1926, then Tina in 1929, and then a son, George, the boy who would one day be expected to carry the fleet forward. And here is something worth sitting with for a moment. From the very beginning, Tina lived in the middle. Older sister ahead of her, the longed-for son behind her. Eugenia was the first, George was the heir, and Tina was the one in between. It is a small thing, the order in which you are born. But in a family built around dynasty and succession, the middle is its own particular place to stand. The Livanos family did not belong to a single country. They belonged to the sea and to the cities where shipping money lived. London, where Tina was born. Paris. And above all, New York. When the war came to Europe, Stavros Livanos did what the great shipping families did. He moved his fleet and his family to safer waters, and for years the Livanos household lived in the United States, much of that time in a suite at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan, overlooking Central Park. Picture that for a moment. A childhood spent not in a single home with a single garden, but in hotel suites and ocean liners and grand houses in whichever city the business required. Tina grew up fluent in the geography of the very rich. She was educated the way daughters of such families were educated. Governesses, private tutors. Languages, because a Livanos daughter was expected to move through London and Paris and New York and Athens without ever being a stranger anywhere. She learned how to dress, how to enter a room, how to sit at a table where the other guests might be princes or financiers or famous names from the newspapers. By the time she was a teenager, she had met more powerful people than most adults meet in a lifetime, and she had learned to treat that as ordinary, because for her it was, and she was beautiful. This is not a small detail in her story. It is one of the central facts of it. Tina was small, slim, with a delicate face and an ease in front of a camera that would follow her all her life. Photographers liked her. The people who arranged the marriages, and the parties, and the alliances of the shipping world, noticed her. In a family that dealt in assets, a beautiful, well-bred daughter was understood quietly, and without anyone ever saying it out loud, to be an asset of her own. That is the harder truth underneath the glamour. Tina grew up in a world of almost unimaginable privilege, and that privilege came with a price that nobody named directly. She was raised to be married well. Not necessarily married happily, but married in a way that strengthened the family and the fleet. The daughters of shipping dynasties were, in a sense, part of the cargo. Their marriages joined houses the way mergers join companies. Love, if it came, was a bonus. It was not the point. And so, by the middle of the 1940s, as the war ended and the world began to right itself, Tina Livanos was a young woman of 15, 16, 17, standing at the edge of the life that had been arranged for her before she was old enough to understand it. She had the beauty, she had the name, she had the fortune behind her, she had everything the world tells you should make a person safe. What she did not have, not yet, was any real idea of what it would cost her. Because the man who was about to walk into her family's drawing room, the man her father knew, the man who was charming and relentless, and already wealthy and already much, much older than she was, would change the course of her entire life. And the strange thing, the thing that makes her story what it is that almost everyone around her thought it was a triumph. It was, in every way that mattered, the beginning of the end. That is where we have to go next. The man who walked into the Livanos world was named Aristotle Onassis, and he did not come from money. He came from fire. He had been born in Smyrna, a Greek city on the coast of what is now Turkey, into a comfortable merchant family. And then, in 1922, when he was a teenager, the city burned. The Great Fire of Smyrna destroyed the Greek and Armenian quarters and scattered or killed much of the population. Onassis lost relatives. He lost the world he had grown up in. And he arrived, eventually, in Argentina with almost nothing. A young man who had watched everything solid in his life turn to ash. You have to understand that about him, because it explains the rest. A man who has lost everything once will spend the remainder of his life making sure he can never lose it again. He will gather money and ships and power around himself like a wall. And gather them he did. He started by importing tobacco, then moved into shipping, buying his first vessels during the Depression when other men were terrified and prices were low. By the time he reached his late 30s, Aristotle Onassis was a wealthy man and a rising one, ambitious in a way that the older, more established Greek shipping families found both impressive and slightly vulgar. He was not Chios aristocracy. He was a self-made outsider clawing his way to the center of a world that had not invited him. The center of that world was Stavros Livanos. So when Onassis set his sights on the Livanos family, he was doing two things at once. He was pursuing a beautiful young woman, and he was pursuing a place at the table he had not been born to. The two were never entirely separate. With men like Onassis, they rarely are. The most widely repeated account of how it began goes like this. Onassis approached Stavros Livanos with an interest in marrying one of his daughters. Eugenia, the eldest, was of marriageable age, and by the old custom the eldest daughter married first. But Onassis, the story goes, wanted Tina, the younger one, the one with the delicate face and the easy way in front of a camera. The exact details of those negotiations remain debated, as such private family matters always do. But the outcome is not in dispute. Aristotle Onassis married Athina Livanos. She was 17 years old. He was around 40. Sit with that for a moment, because it is easy to read past it. 17 and 40. He had lived an entire life before she finished school. He had built a fortune, survived a catastrophe, conducted affairs and business deals across 3 continents, while she had been moving between hotel suites with her governesses. The gap between them was not just years. It was experience, power, knowledge of the world. He knew exactly what he was doing. She was a girl who had been raised to be married well, now married to a man who embodied everything her family valued and everything her family quietly distrusted. They were married on the 28th of December, 1946, in New York City. And in the language of the shipping world, it was not a love match. First, it was a union of empires. The Livanos fleet and the Onassis fleet, the old Chios name and the brilliant outsider, joined through a teenage bride. The following year, Tina's older sister Eugenia married Stavros Niarchos, another rising shipping magnate and Onassis's great rival. And so, within a span of 2 years, the two Livanos daughters were married to the two men who would dominate Greek shipping for a generation. 2 sisters, 2 tycoons, 2 empires bound to the house of Livanos. It is one of the most remarkable facts in this entire story, and it is worth pausing on, because almost no one at the time saw anything wrong with it. It was considered a triumph. Stavros Livanos had placed his daughters magnificently. The newspapers admired it. The families celebrated it. Two young women had been delivered into the 2 greatest fortunes available, and everyone agreed they were the luckiest girls alive. And for a while, from the outside, it looked exactly like that. Tina took to her new life with the polish she had been trained for since childhood. She was young, beautiful, immensely rich, married to one of the most dynamic men in the world. The doors that opened to her were the doors that opened to almost no one. She was photographed, admired, invited everywhere. She had moved seamlessly from being the daughter of an empire to being the wife of one. The transition looked effortless, but underneath, the arithmetic of the marriage never changed. She was a young woman married to a much older man who had chosen her, in part, for what she represented. Onassis was charming, generous when it suited him, and capable of real tenderness. He was also controlling, restless, and accustomed to being the most important person in any room, including his own home. A man who has built a wall of money and ships around himself does not easily let another person stand as his equal inside it. And Tina, for all her beauty and breeding, was not his equal in his eyes. She was younger. She was, in the unspoken logic of his world, something he had acquired. For the first years, the wall held and the marriage shone. There were 2 children coming, a yacht being dreamed of, a place in the world that no amount of money could otherwise buy. But the thing about a marriage built as a merger is that mergers can be undone. And the man who had spent his life making sure he could never lose anything again had not yet met the one person who would make him willing to risk losing all of it. That comes later. First, there were the golden years. And to understand how far Tina fell, you have to see how high she stood. For a few years, Tina Onassis had what looked, from every angle, like the best life money could build. And the clearest symbol of it, the thing that made the whole world understand exactly how rich and how charmed this couple was, floated on the Mediterranean and carried her daughter's name. But before the yacht, there were the children. Alexander was born first on the 30th of April, 1948, in New York City. He was the son and heir, the boy who would one day carry the Onassis fortune forward, and Aristotle adored him in the fierce, possessive way that men like him love their sons. Then came a daughter, born on the 11th of December, 1950, also in New York. They named her Christina, and here is a quiet detail that tells you something about the family. The great yacht, when it came, was named not for the son, but for the daughter, Christina, the girl who would carry the heaviest weight of this entire story to her own early grave, was, as a baby, the namesake of the most famous private vessel in the world. Tina was barely into her 20s with 2 small children and a husband who was building, by the mid-1950s, one of the largest shipping fortunes on Earth. She was beautiful, she was a mother, she was the wife of a titan. On paper, there was nothing left to want, and then Onassis bought a former Canadian frigate and spent a fortune turning it into the Christina O, and the world got to see what this kind of money could actually do. The yacht was not a boat. It was a floating palace, and a statement, and a weapon. Onassis poured millions into it at a time when millions meant something close to what hundreds of millions mean now. There were guest suites named after Greek islands, each one done in marble and rare wood. There was a swimming pool whose mosaic floor could be raised to become a dance floor. There were bar stools, famously upholstered in the skin of whales, a detail that delighted and scandalized in equal measure. There was a children's playroom, a surgery, a crew of dozens. It was, in its day, the most celebrated private vessel afloat, and it existed for one reason above all others. It was the stage on which Aristotle Onassis would entertain the most powerful and famous people in the world, and prove, finally and beyond any argument, that the outsider from Smyrna belonged among them. And he did entertain them. Winston Churchill sailed on the Christina more than once, an old man by then, wrapped in blankets, with Onassis playing the gracious host to one of the towering figures of the century. Greta Garbo came aboard. Statesmen, film stars, royalty, the very rich. The guest list of the Christina in those years reads like an index of the mid-20th century, and at the center of it, again and again, was Tina. Young, slim, perfectly dressed, the hostess of the most glamorous floating salon on Earth. Look at the photographs from those years, and you see a woman who appears to have everything: sunlight on the water, beautiful clothes, famous faces. 2 healthy children, a husband at the height of his powers. It is the image of a charmed life, and in many real ways, parts of it were exactly that. Tina loved beautiful things, loved society, loved the warmth and movement of that world. She was good at it. She had been raised for it since before she could remember. But you have to look closer. Because the Christina was not Tina's. It was Onassis's. Everything on it, the suites, the guests, the rhythm of the days, existed to serve his appetite for importance. He was the sun the whole vessel orbited. And a woman who is the hostess of her husband's stage is not quite the same thing as a partner in a shared life. She was decorative. She was essential to the picture. But the picture was his. There was also the matter of who Onassis actually was when the guests went home. He was a man of enormous charm and enormous will. And the will did not switch off inside his own family. He was controlling about money, about movement, about the children, about Tina herself. He could be tender and then cold, generous and then dismissive. He was, by many accounts, frequently unfaithful, in the casual way of powerful men of that era who considered fidelity a rule that applied to their wives and not to themselves. Tina was young, and she was learning, slowly, that the most magnificent cage in the world is still a cage. And there is something poignant in the geography of it all. She had grown up moving between hotel suites and ocean liners, never quite rooted in a single home. Now she was an adult, and her life was again lived on the water, in motion, on a vessel that belonged to someone else and bore her daughter's name. She had traded one floating world for another. The continuity is striking and not entirely comforting. Some people spend their whole lives looking for solid ground and never quite reach it. By the late 1950s, Tina was approaching 30. She had been married for more than a decade. She had given Onassis a son and a daughter and a flawless public image. She had done everything the role required. And the marriage, beneath the parties and the photographs, was growing quietly hollow. What she did not yet know was that the thing which would finally break it would not be the ordinary infidelities, the passing affairs that wealthy wives of that world were expected to endure in silence. It would be something Onassis had never experienced before, not an appetite, but an obsession. A woman who would not be a passing affair, who would walk onto the Christina as a guest and refuse to walk off as one. Her name was Maria Callas, and when she came aboard, the charmed life of Tina Onassis began to come apart in front of the entire world. In the summer of 1959, Aristotle Onassis arranged a cruise on the Christina, and among the guests he invited were the most celebrated opera singer in the world and her husband. Maria Callas was, at that moment, perhaps the most famous soprano alive. She was Greek, like Onassis, born in New York to Greek parents, and she had risen to a kind of fame from that singers rarely reach, the sort that spills past the opera house and into the ordinary world. Her voice, her temperament, her presence on a stage, all of it had made her a legend. She was married to an older Italian businessman named Giovanni Battista Meneghini, who had managed her career and her life for years. Onassis pursued the Callas connection the way he pursued everything, because she was the most important person available, and he wanted her aboard his stage. So the cruise set out. Onassis and Tina, Callas and her husband. Winston Churchill was aboard as well, the old statesman, by then a fixture of the Christina. From the outside, it was another glittering voyage, another assembly of famous names on the most famous yacht in the world. But somewhere on that cruise, something shifted between Onassis and Callas. The exact moment, the exact details, remain the subject of biography and rumor, as these things always do. What is not in dispute is the outcome. By the end of that voyage, 2 marriages were effectively over. Onassis and Callas had begun a relationship that would not be hidden, would not be discreet, and would not pass. They were not careful, they were not ashamed. And the world found out almost immediately. Tina was on that yacht. She watched it happen, or near enough. She was 30 years old, the mother of his 2 children. The wife, who had held the picture together for 13 years, and she found herself a passenger on her own husband's vessel while he fell, openly, for another woman. There is a particular cruelty in that setting. The Christina was the symbol of everything they had built together. It carried her daughter's name, and it became the place where her marriage publicly ended, with guests aboard, with the press already circling. What followed was not a quiet, managed separation of the kind wealthy couples usually arrange. It became a scandal on an international scale. The newspapers seized it. The opera diva, the shipping tycoon, the wronged wife, the abandoned husband. It was a story too good to leave alone, and they did not leave it alone. For a woman who had been raised to value discretion above almost everything, who came from a family that wore its dignity like armor, the public nature of the humiliation was its own distinct wound, separate from the betrayal itself. And here you have to be careful, because it would be easy to flatten these people into roles. The villain, the victim, the other woman. But life is not that tidy, and people are not that simple. Onassis was not simply a cruel man discarding a faithful wife. He was, by every account, genuinely consumed by Callas in a way he had never been by anyone, including, it seems, himself. The affair was the central passion of his life. Callas, for her part, would pay a terrible price for it, giving up much of her career and ultimately being discarded herself years later when Onassis left her to marry Jacqueline Kennedy. There were no winners in that particular entanglement. There rarely are. And Tina, the wronged wife, was not a passive victim either. She was a woman who had been raised to endure and who decided, in the end, not to. Because Tina did something that the women of her world were not really expected to do. She left. She did not suffer in silence. She did not preserve the marriage for the sake of appearances, the way so many wives in her position had done before her. In 1960, she initiated the end of it. The divorce was finalized that year, and in handling it, Tina showed a flash of the steel that ran underneath the delicate, photogenic surface. The most widely reported account is that she chose, in her public statements, not to name Callas at all, citing the divorce on other grounds and refusing to give the press the spectacle they wanted. Whether that was pride or dignity or a wish to shield her children from the ugliest version of the story, it was a decision that kept some measure of control in her own hands at the moment she had the least power. But control is not the same as healing, because look at what she actually walked away from and what she walked away with. She was 31 years old. She had been married to Onassis since she was 17, which meant she had been his wife for nearly her entire adult life. She had built her identity around being the wife of an empire, and now that identity was gone, taken from her in the most public way imaginable. She had 2 children who would remain entangled with their father and his fortune forever. And she had learned, at an age when many people are just beginning to understand themselves, that the safety she had been promised, the safety of beauty and money and a good marriage, was no safety at all. It could be taken in a single summer on a single cruise by a single voice. After the divorce, Tina did something small and quietly telling. She dropped the Onassis name and went back to being a Livanos. She returned, in a sense, to the identity she had before any of it began, as if she were trying to find the girl who had existed before the marriage swallowed her whole. But you cannot go back. That is one of the harder truths this story keeps insisting on. Tina was not 17 anymore. She could take her name back, but she could not take back the years or undo what they had taught her. She was a divorced woman in her early 30s, beautiful, wealthy, and suddenly, for the first time in her life, without a defined place to stand. So she did what she had always done. She looked for the next world to belong to. And she found it not on a yacht this time, and not in Greece, but in the old aristocracy of England, in a man with a title and an ancient name, who could offer her something Onassis never could. She was about to become a marchioness. If Onassis represented new money, raw and self-made and faintly scandalous, then the man Tina married next represented its opposite in almost every way. He was Old England. He was bloodline. He was a name that went back to the 17th century, and a title that came with one of the greatest houses in the country. His name was John Spencer Churchill, and he carried the courtesy title Marquess of Blandford, the title borne by the heir to the Duke of Marlborough. The Marlborough dukedom was among the most storied in England. The family seat was Blenheim Palace, the vast Baroque house in Oxfordshire where Winston Churchill himself had been born. This was not the world of shipping fortunes and floating palaces. This was the world of inherited land, of ancient titles, of a kind of status that no amount of money could purchase because it could only be born into. Tina married him on the 23rd of October, 1961, a little over a year after her divorce from Onassis. And you can understand the appeal if you look at it from the right angle. After everything Onassis had been, the restlessness, the obsession, the public humiliation, here was a man who offered the opposite: stability, respectability, an old name and an old house, and a settled place in a world that did not orbit a single overwhelming ego. For a woman who had just learned how little protection wealth alone provided, the solidity of English aristocracy must have looked like exactly the ground she had been searching for her whole life. And there was something else in it too, something quieter. By marrying Blandford, Tina became a marchioness. She acquired a title in her own right, a standing that was hers and not merely borrowed from a husband's fortune. For a woman who had spent her first marriage as the decorative hostess of someone else's stage, there was a real dignity in becoming, by name and rank, somebody. The Marchioness of Blandford was a long way from being the 17-year-old delivered into a merger, so Tina entered English life. She took on the role, moved in those circles, played the part of an aristocratic wife, with the same training and polish she had brought to everything since childhood. The girl who had been raised to move through any drawing room in the world found herself in the drawing rooms of the English nobility, and she fit, because she had been built to fit. But here is the pattern, and by now you can probably see it coming, because Tina's life keeps tracing the same shape. She kept marrying into worlds rather than into partnerships. She kept attaching herself to a name, a fortune, a position, a stage that belonged to someone else. With Onassis it was the shipping empire and the yacht. With Blandford it was the dukedom and Blenheim. Each time she stepped into a structure that was already standing, already someone else's, and took her place inside it. And each time the structure could not give her the one thing she seems to have been quietly looking for underneath all of it, which was a place that was genuinely, unconditionally her own. The marriage to Blandford lasted roughly a decade, which is not nothing, but it did not hold. The exact texture of its decline is not as well documented as the operatic collapse of her first marriage, and that itself tells you something. There was no callous this time, no single dramatic betrayal played out on the front pages. It was the quieter kind of ending, the kind where two people who married for reasons that made sense at the time slowly discovered that the reasons were not enough. They separated, and the marriage ended in 1971. So consider where Tina stood by the early 1970s. She was in her early 40s. She had been married twice, to two of the most different men imaginable, the brilliant outsider and the inheritor of an ancient name, and both marriages had ended. She had been the wife of an empire and the marchioness of a dukedom, and neither role had become a life she could keep. Her children were grown, or nearly so, and entangled with their father's world. She was still beautiful. She was still immensely wealthy. And she was, once again, between worlds, without a defined place to stand. But while Tina had been living her English life, becoming a marchioness, then ceasing to be one, something terrible had been unfolding in the other half of her family. Her sister Eugenia, the elder Livanos' daughter, the one who had married Onassis's great rival, was living her own version of this story, a few miles to the side of Tina's, on a private Greek island. And in the spring of 1970, while Tina's second marriage was in its final decline, Eugenia died. How she died, and what Tina did in the wake of it, is the strangest and most unsettling turn in this entire story, because the world Tina chose to step into next was not a new one at all. It was her own sister's. To understand what Tina did next, you have to go back and follow the other Livanos' daughter, the one we left at the altar in 1947. Because while Tina's life had been unfolding on yachts and in English drawing rooms, her older sister Eugenia had been living a parallel life, and that life was about to end in a way that would cast a long shadow over everything that came after. Eugenia Livanos had married Stavros Niarchos in 1947, the year after Tina married Onassis, and here the symmetry of this family becomes almost unbearable. Two sisters, two rival shipping magnates. Niarchos and Onassis were not merely competitors. They were the two great titans of Greek shipping, locked in a rivalry that was personal as much as commercial, two self-made men measuring themselves endlessly against each other, in tonnage, in fortune, in fame, in the women they married. And the Livanos sisters were on opposite sides of that rivalry, each one the wife of the other man's greatest enemy. Imagine the family gatherings. Imagine the undercurrents at every shared table. Eugenia and Niarchos had 4 children together. Their marriage, like Tina's, was the marriage of a young woman to a powerful, difficult, controlling man, and like Tina's, it was not happy beneath the surface. Niarchos was, by many accounts, even harder than Onassis, colder, more ruthless, with a temper that those around him learned to fear. The Niarchos family had a private island, Spetsopoula, in the waters off the Greek coast, a kingdom of their own, where the rules were whatever Niarchos decided they were. And it was on Spetsopoula, on the 4th of May, 1970, that Eugenia Livanos was found dead. The official cause was an overdose of barbiturates. But the circumstances were murky from the start, and they have remained murky ever since. There were reportedly bruises on her body. There were questions about what had happened in the hours before her death, about an argument, about Niarchos's account of events, which is said to have shifted. A medical and legal inquiry followed. And in the end, the inquiry exonerated Stavros Niarchos. No charge was brought. The death was ruled, officially, the result of the overdose. The exact truth of what happened on that island that night has never been established, and almost certainly never will be. What remains is a wealthy, difficult man, a dead wife, an overdose of barbiturates, and a cloud of suspicion that the legal process formally cleared, but the human imagination never quite has. Eugenia was 43 years old, the elder Livanos' daughter, Tina's only sister. Now hold all of that in your mind, because what comes next is the part that people who hear this story for the first time often refuse to believe. In October of 1971, a little over a year after Eugenia died on that island, and the same year her own second marriage formally ended, Tina Livanos married Stavros Niarchos, her dead sister's husband. The man the inquiry had cleared, but not cleansed. The man over whose home, over whose private island, the question of how Eugenia had died still hung. Tina married him. She became the second Livanos sister to be the wife of Stavros Niarchos, and she stepped knowingly into the exact place her sister had occupied when she died. It is almost impossible to look at directly, and any honest telling has to resist the urge to explain it too quickly. Why would she do it? We do not fully know, and we should be careful about pretending we do. There are the practical readings, the ones that treat it as a kind of dynastic arithmetic. With Eugenia gone, there was a sense in that world of fortunes and bloodlines that a Livanos' daughter should remain at Niarchos's side, that the alliance should hold, that the children, Eugenia's 4 children, Tina's nieces and nephews, needed a mother and an aunt who was already family. There is a version of this where Tina married Niarchos partly to keep her sister's children within reach, to hold the family together across the gap that Eugenia's death had torn open. And there are darker readings, the ones the human mind reaches for almost against its will. That she was drawn, again, to a powerful and dangerous man, the same shape she had married the first time. That she could not stay away from the orbit of these enormous, devouring figures, because that orbit was the only world she had ever known how to live in. We do not get to choose between these. The most honest thing to say is that all of them probably hold some truth, and none of them holds all of it. People are not that simple. Tina was a woman who had spent her entire life stepping into worlds that already belonged to powerful men, and now, in her grief and her dislocation, she stepped into the one her own sister had just died inside. Whatever her reasons, and they were surely tangled past any clean accounting, she did it with her eyes open. She knew the story, she knew what people whispered, and she married him anyway. So picture her now, in 1971, 42 years old. twice divorced and now married a third time. The wife of the man her sister had been married to when she died of an overdose on a private island. Tina had come full circle in the most terrible way, back into the Niarchos world, back onto the water and the islands of the very rich, the same kind of world she had been born into and married into, and never once managed to escape. And the dark symmetry of it was not finished. Because Tina had now stepped into her sister's exact position, and within 3 short years she would share her sister's exact fate. But before that, before the ending, the family had one more loss to absorb, the cruelest one of all. It did not come for Tina, or for Niarchos, or for any of the aging magnates. It came for her son. Of all the people in this story, the one who seemed to carry the most hope was Alexander. He was the heir, the son Onassis adored, the boy the whole Onassis fortune had been built to pass down to. And he was the one death came for first. Alexander Onassis had grown into a young man by the early 1970s, and he had not had an easy time of it, despite everything money could provide. He was the son of 2 parents whose marriage had detonated publicly when he was a child. He had grown up shuttled between countries, between his father's world and his mother's, between Greece and France and England, with tutors, instead of a settled school and an apartment of his own at an age when most boys are still at home. His father loved him fiercely and controlled him just as fiercely, grooming him to inherit the empire while rarely letting him feel free inside it. Alexander, by many accounts, chafed against all of it. He wanted aviation, not shipping. He fell in love with an older woman his father disapproved of. He was, in the way of so many heirs to enormous fortunes, both immensely privileged and not quite permitted to own his own life. But he was young and alive, and the future was supposed to belong to him. On the 23rd of January 1973, Alexander Onassis boarded a small aircraft at the airport in Athens. He was overseeing a piloting matter connected to the family's aviation interests. The plane took off, and seconds later it crashed. Alexander suffered catastrophic head injuries. He was rushed to a hospital, and the most renowned specialists in the world were summoned, flown in by his father, who would have moved the earth itself to save his son. But there was nothing to be done. The injuries were beyond any surgeon's reach. Alexander Onassis died the day after the crash. He was 24 years old. The cause of the crash was investigated and debated, as such things are when they happen to the very rich and the very famous. Onassis himself, consumed by grief, reportedly became obsessed with the idea that it had been no accident, that someone had sabotaged the plane to strike at him through his son. He offered enormous sums for information. He chased theories. He could not accept that the universe had simply taken his boy through ordinary, meaningless catastrophe. But no plot was ever proven. The most credible accounts point to an accident, a tragedy without a villain, which is in some ways the hardest kind to bear. There is no one to blame. There is only the absence where a son used to be. For Aristotle Onassis, it was the end of something. People who knew him in those final years describe a man who was broken in a way that all his wealth could not touch. The wall he had spent his whole life building, the fortress of money and ships against ever losing anything again, had failed at the one point that mattered most. He had lost the thing he could not replace. Biographers describe him as a man who simply stopped fighting after Alexander died. His own health declined. He would be dead himself within little more than 2 years. And Tina. Tina was Alexander's mother. Whatever had come between her and Onassis, whatever the divorce and the years and the other marriages had put between them, this was their son. The boy born in New York in 1948. When she was 19 and the marriage still shone, they had made him together in the golden years, before Callas, before any of it. And now he was gone at 24, and the two of them, the divorced parents who had spent a decade and more in separate worlds, were bound again, this, one last time, by the worst thing that can happen to a mother and a father. The accounts of those who saw Tina and Onassis in the aftermath describe two people moving through the world like the living dead. Walking zombies, one description put it, present in body and absent in every other way. Grief had reached into the two of them and hollowed out whatever remained of the people they had been. It did not matter, in the face of this, that they had divorced. It did not matter that she was now married to Niarchos, or that Onassis was married to Jacqueline Kennedy by then. The roles and the marriages and the fortunes all fell away. They were simply Alexander's mother and Alexander's father, and Alexander was dead. Tina was 43 years old when she lost her son. The same age, almost exactly, that her sister Eugenia had been when she died on Spetsopula. The numbers in this family keep rhyming in ways that feel less like coincidence and more like fate, though we know that is only the mind reaching for pattern in the dark. She had now lost almost everything that a person can lose and still keep breathing. Her first marriage, to scandal. Her sister, to a Greek island and an overdose and a cloud of suspicion. Her second marriage, to quiet decline. And now her son, her firstborn, the heir, gone in an instant on a runway in Athens. What was left of Tina Livanos, by the end of 1973, was a woman who had run out of worlds to escape into, married to a man whose first Livanos wife had died mysteriously, carrying a grief that her enormous wealth was utterly powerless against. She had a little less than 2 years left to live, and when the end came for her, in a quiet mansion in Paris, it would arrive wearing the same face that had come for her sister. In the early hours of the 10th of October, 1974, in a grand private mansion in Paris, called the Hotel de Chanelay, Tina Livanos died in her bed. She was 45 years old. In another room of the same house, her husband, Stavros Niarchos, was asleep and did not know until morning that anything had happened at all. The official cause of death was given as an acute edema of the lung, a swelling, a flooding, the lungs filling in a way the body cannot survive. That was the ruling the pathologists put their names to. But almost from the first, another explanation moved alongside the official one and never went away. That she had died, as her sister had died, from barbiturates. That the real cause was an overdose, accidental or otherwise, of the same kind of drug that had killed Eugenia on Spetsopula 4 years before. Stop and look at what that means, because it is almost too much symmetry for a real life to hold. 2 sisters, both Livanos' daughters, both married to Stavros Niarchos, both found dead in his homes. Both deaths attributed, in the accounts that have followed them down the decades, to barbiturates. Eugenia in 1970, on a private Greek island. With a cloud of suspicion, the inquiry cleared but never dispersed. Tina in 1974, in a Paris mansion, with her husband sleeping nearby. The elder sister and the younger sister dying the same death, married to the same man 4 years apart. If you read it in a novel, you would put the book down and say it was too much, that no author would dare. These were real women, and they really died this way, and the man they shared outlived them both. What is the truth of Tina's death? We do not know, and we should be honest that we do not. The official record says her lungs failed. The persistent whisper says barbiturates. There has never been a definitive public reckoning that settled it beyond argument, and at this distance there almost certainly never will be. What we can say is what the facts will support, and no more. A 45-year-old woman who had lost her son 20 months earlier, who had buried her sister 4 years before that, who had watched 2 marriages end and her whole gilded world prove hollow, died in the night, in a house that belonged to her dead sister's widower. Whether by her own grief-worn body, or by the drugs that people in that much pain so often reach for, or by something darker that no inquiry ever proved, she died. The rest is silence and speculation and the long appetite of rumor. She was buried at the Bois de Vaux Cemetery in Lausanne, Switzerland, and she was laid to rest next to her sister. Eugenia and Tina, the two Livanos daughters, side by side in the ground at last, reunited in death in a way that life, with all its rivalries and fortunes and shared and terrible husband, had never quite allowed. The story did not end cleanly, because these stories never do. There was money to fight over, and a great deal of it. Tina left an estate estimated at around $250 million in the currency of the time, an immense fortune, and her daughter Christina Onassis, the girl whose name was on the yacht, the only one of Tina's two children still living, went to war over it. Christina sued Stavros Niarchos, her stepfather and her mother's widower, contending that the marriage should be annulled under Greek law and that the fortune should not pass to him. In time, the lawsuit was dropped, and Niarchos returned his late wife's money, her jewelry, her artwork, and her personal effects to Christina. The fortune came back, in the end, to the last surviving Livanos and Onassis heir. But think about what that fortune had cost, and who was left to hold it. Christina Onassis inherited the wreckage of all of them. Within a few short years, she had lost her brother to a runway in Athens, her mother to a Paris mansion, and her father, Aristotle, who died in 1975, less than 6 months after Tina, a broken man who had never recovered from his son. By her late 20s, Christina was the heir to one of the great fortunes of the century and almost entirely alone in the world. She would marry 4 times, searching, as her mother had searched, for something the money could not buy. And she would die in 1988 in Argentina at the age of 37 of heart failure that has often been linked to years of strain and pharmaceuticals and grief. Younger than her mother, younger than her aunt. The third woman in that immediate family to die too soon, with a fortune intact and a life that the fortune could not save. And so we come back to where we began. To a beautiful girl, born in Kensington in 1929, into one of the great shipping fortunes of the 20th century. A girl raised in hotel suites and on ocean liners, taught to move gracefully through any room in the world, handed every advantage that money and beauty and name can confer. She had it all in the way the world means when it says someone has it all. The beauty that made photographers turn, the billions that bought yachts and titles, and the company of presidents and kings. And, threaded through all of it, the betrayals, the one she suffered on her own husband's yacht, the one that hangs over her sister's death, the one she may or may not have committed against her sister's memory by taking that sister's place. Beauty, billions, and betrayal. The title was never an exaggeration. It was simply her life, and the deepest thing her story leaves us with is not the scandal or the money or even the strange repeating deaths. It is the quiet, stubborn fact underneath all of it, that none of what she was given protected her from any of what came. That a person can have everything the world tells you to want, and still spend a whole life looking for solid ground, and still die in the dark in someone else's house at 45. We want wealth and beauty to be a kind of shelter. Tina Livanos is the proof, written across 45 years and 3 marriages and 2 generations of early graves, that they are not, they never were. She is buried beside her sister in Lausanne, where the rivalries finally fell quiet, and where the only thing left of 2 empires is 2 women, side by side, at rest. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.